Hello friends, I'm Professor Seema Bawa. I teach at the Department of History and I'm basically an art historian by training. And we've been discussing a series, or in a series of lectures, we've basically been discussing how art evolved in India. And last time we had discussed Mathura art, which presented to us one element of classicism and a stage in the development of iconography of Indian art. Today we are going to go to the Deccan and discuss Amaravati, which is in the Guntur district of Andhra Pradesh, and we will be trying to see how this art at Amaravati developed, and secondly, the other problem that we will be taking up as a thematic is what are the elements of classicism that we see at Amaravati. So, basically if we look at Amaravati and the entire plan of Amaravati, we see that Amaravati is basically a Mahastup, and it is the largest and the grandest of all stupas found in the region. There are many other stupas in Andhra Pradesh region such as Jayapet, Goli, Ghantashal, Bhatti Prolu and Nagarjun Kund. And of course, everybody has heard of Nagarjun Kund because it is again a very important Buddhist as well as Brahmanical site from the post-Mauryan period. From say about the 1st century BC onwards, both at Amaravati and at Nagarjun Kund, we see a lot of building and construction activity. The stup of Amaravati and other associated sites in Andhra Pradesh were products of a complex package made up of civilization, polity and economy of the area. By this, what we mean is that it rose along with state, social and cultural formations in the Andhra Pradesh. There was, after the Mauryas, a certain kind of polity developing based on the Shatavahanas and later the Ikshvakus. The polity that was here developing was first based on Buddhism, and this we know from Shatavahana inscriptions that are largely Buddhist in the earlier period, and they later become Brahmanical in content. So, there is a certain patronage to Buddhism being established by the Shatavahanas in the early part of the Christian era or the common era. The other important thing is that along with political formation, we also have the coming up of administrative and political classes such as the Maharathas, the lesser kings who paid obeisance to the Shatavahanas. Secondly, there is a very strong economic base which we will be discussing as we go along to this area, and this is based largely on trade and agriculture, but also a very well developed trading network in and around this area, because we know for a fact that in Arikamedu near Chennai, there was a Roman settlement in which traders from the Western world came and settled and traded with the West. And also we do have a trade network with Southeast Asia. So, there is a composite trading activity both to the east as well as west, which leads to prosperity in the Krishna Delta. There of course is agrarian activity that is given a boost by social and political formations such as the Shatavahanas and later the Ikshvaku dynasties. Thirdly, when we talk about social formations, this is where class differentiation starts. And stratified societies emerge, and this we see in the inscriptions, especially donative inscriptions of the region, where we are hearing of traders as a distinct category. We are hearing of guilds, we are hearing of differentiation and specialization of crafts. There are goldsmiths and ivory workers, and there are oil pressers, and these kind of craft and activities are also being represented in the donative inscriptions. Thirdly, you have the beginnings of Varna society, not as stratified as you have in North India, but certain stratifications and hierarchies can be discerned in Andhra Pradesh, which are a product of the civilizational project that probably the Mauryas brought with them when they penetrated into this area with a project of conquest as well as trading contacts. We do have some evidence of Ashoka's presence through his edicts in Andhra as well as North Tamil Nadu, which is significant in terms of giving us some kind of an idea of what kind of social and political formations were there during the Mauryan period. So, if we look at the backdrop of the building activity at Amaravati, we notice that there was a large Buddhist population in the area who not only undertook the project of building this particular stupa, but also their spiritual needs were also being met through this stupa. So, why would they donate? They donated because they need to get spiritual guidance and some kind of religious and ritual activities were being addressed through the stupa and its allied institutions such as the vihara, which means that there must have been a large population of monks. Secondly, we note this is also only possible when there was an adequate supply of raw materials and the presence of skilled artisans to work on these raw materials in the area. Thirdly, adequate resources based on economic surplus that could patronize this building over a large period of its construction. So, not only raw materials and skilled labor, but also one requires a considerable amount of resource base. This can only come when there is surplus, both agrarian and commercial surplus. By agrarian surplus, we mean that the land is producing more than what is being consumed, and this surplus is then being used to fund some construction as well as religious activities. And this is something that that did not happen only for 10 years or 20 years, but over 300 years. So, there is a consistent level of economic surplus being deployed in construction activity at Amaravati and associated sites such as Bhatripolu and Anagarjankonda, right. Now, how do we know that there is a surplus and there is trading activities is because of the presence of a very important port town called Dharanikota on the mouth of the river Krishna, all right. And it's a very ancient city that has been excavated in the last few decades, and this is about half a kilometer downstream on the mouth of the delta. Okay? And the significance of Dharanikota is that it was a port on the river that allowed an enormous waterway that could be easily navigated by large ships into the hinterland of Andhra Pradesh. So, this port and the river behind it, these were allowing large vessels that could carry a lot of materials raw as well as finished materials from the hinterland to the port. And these prosperous commercial relations led to an increase in the prosperity of the area and generating a certain surplus that could then be used for construction, as I have already said. This is attested to by donative inscriptions found carved on the stupa that refer to merchants as well as royal patrons. So, this who must have derived the riches from the trade. So, the royal patrons themselves were garnering taxes and levies and customs from trading activities is what we can infer, and the traders themselves had considerable resources at their disposal. Okay. As far as Buddhism is concerned, Buddhism was a significant factor in the religious milieu of Andhra Pradesh from the Mauryan period onwards, and the society was literate, complex and highly organized. What we know that when the Mauryas came down to the south, especially under the rule of Ashoka, they brought with them not only Buddhism but also literacy, Brahmi, as well the script Brahmi, and the language structures such as Prakrit are attested to in the inscriptions of Ashoka. This tells us that some kind of literary structures, literary complexes were being brought to Deccan from North India with the penetration of the Mauryas. Secondly, that the society was not at a primitive level but was complex and highly organized enough to fund and use such monuments and give rise to such monumental architecture. And it is at Amaravati also that we see a transition from an iconic representation characteristics of Theravada in Buddhism to representing the Buddha in his anthropomorphic form. That is, that as you would recall, that in early Buddhism, Buddha is not represented through his human form. He is represented through some symbols which are aniconic, that is, they are not iconic. Symbols such as the footprints, or it could be the stupa, it could be the bodhi tree, it could be an empty seat with worshippers on two sides. So, these are some of the symbols which Theravada Buddhism, that is old Buddhism, employed to depict the Buddha. At Amaravati stupa itself, we see a transition to the Mahayana tradition where the Buddha is actually shown in his iconic form, that is in his human anthropomorphic form. And this is very interesting because there are times when there is, Buddha is not being shown, but there are times when Buddha is shown. Right? Now, the stupa itself, and I will be showing you parts of the stupa. The stupa itself consists of a huge solid dome, of a huge solid dome mounted on a cylindrical drum-like platform, and the whole was surrounded by a great railing. There are gateways or toranas at each of the cardinal points that let the devotee enter into the railing, through the railing into the Pradakshina path or the circumambulatory processional path that is paved with black flagstones. Now, why I am using the past tense in this is because the Amaravati Stupa is no longer extant. There is nothing left of the Amaravati Stupa. In the 19th century itself, a lot of the material that was at Amaravati was first shifted to Chennai and then to Britain. And now it is in the collection of the British Museum, where there is an entire gallery called the Amaravati Gallery that is devoted to displaying these works. Part of this is also, some parts of this collection of antiquities from Amaravati are at the Madras Museum, but the larger portion is in Britain. Now, one of the important features of Amaravati is that there is sculptural ornamentation in and around the drum area. So, you know, the dome at the bottom has a drum, and even on the dome itself it's decorated with sculptures in high relief. Now, this is a new addition. Before this, what we saw was that the railings and the toranas were being carved, but now even the stupa, the and the medhi of the stupa itself are being carved. We see that in the early part of the stupa, the earliest examples of sculpture, which can be dated from 3rd to the 1st century BC, there is an influence of the art of Bharut and Sanchi, right? Slowly we come to the next phase of development, which belongs to the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD or CE, that coincide with the rule of the Shatavahanas in Andhra Pradesh and the later of the Ikshvakus, who continue to adorn the stupa both at Amaravati and at Nagarjunakund. This is known as the mature phase. The sculptures at Amaravati have a profound and quiet naturalism in human, animal and floral forms. There is a sense of movement and energy in the sculptures. Stylistically, the human figures are slender and slightly elongated. The faces are oval with sharp and well delineated features that have quite a bit of expressive content. Animals and such as makaras have scaly naturalism, and the vegetational environment is lush. Now, what we basically are noticing here in terms of style is that unlike the rounded contours of the body that we see at Mathura and before that at Sanchi, here the bodies are becoming elongated and the features from round are becoming oval, and this is a kind of a transition to classicism, which later gets manifest in Gupta as well as Vakatak art. Right? Here what we see is that there is a great emphasis on the narrative content or narrative element, with stories from the life of Buddha and the Bodhisattva dominating, with episodes ranging from the birth of Buddha, the miracle at Sankesh and other miracles, enlightenment, victory over Mara, Sundari and Nand, the depiction of the Tushita heaven, Angulimal and such episodes becoming more important and more elaborate. There are jatakas, there are avadana scenes before this in both Sanchi as well as Bharut, but here they become quite elaborate in their content. The stories that are being told are more complex. There are few jataka scenes such as Shibbi Jatak, Nallagiri Jatak and Chadanta Jatak, but compared to other places, there is more emphasis on the life of Buddha. As I've already said, but I'd like to also talk about this, that the perfection of form and proportion seen in the middle phase of Amaravati, as well as some of the themes, continue to influence art not only at Nagarjun Kund, but also later Vakatak and Gupta art styles. Now I come to some of the illustrations of Amaravati. Since these are in the British Museum, some of these illustrations are taken from books that were published by the British Museum, because they show how originally this was reconstructed at the museum. It was later taken down and again put together in a newly renovated Amaravati gallery in recent years. The first time Douglas Barrett had published a illustrated volume on Amaravati. As you can see, here you will see that there is a lot of crowding in the compositions. Lot of people and a lot of activity is being shown both on the inner as well as the outer face of the railing. This is an illustration of the railing. You can see that every bit of this is illustrated. This is the inner face. On the outer face there are padmas or lotuses, but here the suchis have medallions which have narrative scenes. The stambhas or the pillars also, not only do they have the two half medallions on the top and the bottom and a full medallion in the middle, but the surface between the medallions is also carved. So it's like a very, very crowded, very, very dense sculptural activity in this railing. On the top is the coping stone or the ushnish that kind of unifies the entire railing structure, and here on you can see that there are continuous narratives being carved. So maybe the entire life of a Buddha may be carved on one section, then in another section a particular episode may be elaborated from the life of Buddha. On plan, if you were to, you can see here that on the plan that there is a pradakshina, and instead of the toranas you have ayaka pillars or auspicious pillars, and on the drum of the dome there are sculptural panels. Okay. And here is an illustration of a votive stupa from outside the great stupa, and shows a rendering of the early stupa. That is, the stupa was variegated in its chronology. It was its core is Mauryan. It was then built on by early Shatavahanas and elaborated later by the late Shatavahanas or the great Shatavahanas, and then the Ikshvakus. The period of the great Shatavahanas, the 2nd and the 3rd century CE, is considered to be the mature phase of Amaravati, where there is a large amount of structural as well as more than structural, sculptural activity. Okay. Underneath this you can see a earlier version of the stupa carved on a limestone crossbar with a bodhi tree. The writing under it can be dated to 3rd century BCE on paleographic grounds. Now we come to some of the illustrations. Now what we are seeing here are two sides of an relatively chronological earlier phase of the railing pillar. What you see is on the inner face it is carved, and on the outer face you have the Padmas or the lotuses. Okay. And now what we will be doing some more of these which are more elaborately carved. Now similarly here you have the inner and the outer face faces of the railing pillar. Here you will see on the outer face you have the Padmas, but also the worship of the Stupa and the carrying of the Padma by Yakshas or dwarfs in Atlantis and the bottom part. Similarly, on the inner face, what you see are 3 scenes. The central scene is probably the enlightenment and the worship of the Bodhi tree by various, it could be donors or it could be devotees or celebrants of the occasion when the Buddha gained enlightenment. You can see that the footprints of Buddha has been carved on the empty throne. Similarly, you can see that there are other trees being worshipped. These may be identified with Manushi Buddhas, who each of whom has a tree. Okay. Now we also see a transition from the aniconic phase that you saw previously to this phase when you can see that this is the great departure where the Buddha is leaving his palace and going to Gaya. He is riding his horse Kanthaka, which is being led, and because it's a divine being, the legs of the horse are not allowed to touch the ground. You have dwarfs holding the legs of the horse. There are people who are celebrating as well as lamenting the departure. Underneath this is another scene from the life of Buddha, probably related to his particular either to the interpretation of the dream by Shita or another episode which can be seen on the side where you see the Dharma Chakra, which again is something that is representative of the first sermon at Sarnath. Alright, here is an example of another railing pillar where on the outer side are the usual Padmas or lotuses, but on the inner side you can see these crowded scenes where on the top you can see a scene where Buddha is being venerated by various kinds of figures, and on the bottom part is a scene where Buddha is being prevented from leaving his palace by various ladies of the harem. This illustrates one episode from the Buddha Charita where in one Shuddhodana, the father of Buddha, gets to know that he is contemplating leaving the palace, and he sets all the beautiful ladies of the harem to tempt him. And but he, of course, Buddha remains steadfast as Prince Siddhartha, and there are a lot of descriptions of how women hold his feet and do not want him to leave. So this is something that is being illustrated here. Now, these are pillars, freestanding pillars that must have been on the entrances. But here you can see that there are a number of meditating Buddhas and symbols from early Buddhist iconography that can be seen in these pillars. Now we come to some of the roundels or medallions. This roundel again is very typical of the mature Amaravati phase, where the figures, if you would notice, especially the one in the front of the woman with her rear or her back to the audience or the viewer, you will notice is very elongated and slender, but the contours of the feminine in the male bodies are still being emphasized. Nevertheless, what you also will notice here is a great deal of attention being paid to the proportions of the body, So they are not disproportionate even though they are elongated. What you see is the Mandhata Jatak. The Jatak relates to a rich king or emperor who was a Chakravartin or a universal emperor who ruled the world for over 1,000 years. And as he ruled over the world, he grew discontent and dissatisfied because he had experienced every conceivable desire that any mortal world could offer. So everything from pleasure to joy he had experienced. Now, because he was a Chakravartin, he decided to include the heaven in his sphere. And here again in the heaven he experienced all the delights of heaven, from the apsaras to a lack of effort to achieve anything. But he grew even more ambitious, and he now wanted to get and experience the highest of all heavens, the heaven of Indra or Shakra, the king of the gods himself. The king of the gods, Indra, came to receive him, and this is something that you can see how King and Mandhata and Lord Indra are sharing one couch, because he comes and welcomes him. Of course, this is what the moment that you are seeing, the heaven of Indra with all the celestial nymphs and the gods surrounding the two main protagonists. However, Mandhata remained discontent and came back to earth and died. The parable of this, according to the Jatakas, is that Buddha explains that desire is ever increasing, but desire never leads to happiness. So, one needs to eliminate desire. If you don't, then you will end up like Mandhata, always wanting more but never being happy. Right? The roundels have other scenes where you can more clearly see how the stylistic development takes place in the under the great Shatavahanas at Amaravati. Here again you will see that the relief is considerably high, and the body are more or less completely coming out of stone. There is a great deal of sensuousness that is built into these depictions. On the other hand, what you would notice is that flexibility of the body is being emphasized here. You can see how especially in the body of the figures who are sitting, how they are crouched almost in a circle. So the flexibility of bodies is something that becomes very important. Here you can see that this probably depicts a moment of departure from the palace as the horse is coming out. Right? Another example of a roundel, and this also is a story from the life of Buddha. Here there is the worship of a reliquary. As you can, in the middle on the throne is the relic casket, probably containing the remains of Buddha, but this is shows a Naga king or a Naga Raja with a hood of hood as a crown or a prabha behind him, and the whole scene probably refers to a moment when Nagas received one share of Buddha's relics. As you know that after Buddha's death, there was a dispute over how many shares of relics should there be and who all should get these relics. Right? This again is a very important piece because it shows a moment of probably a miracle being performed by Buddha. This is a railing on the suchi or the crossbar. This is a portion of the railing, crossbar or suchi, which is carved in limestone on its inner face, which shows monks or ascetics and laity worshipping the Buddha, who represented himself as a pillar of fire. And on the top of the pillar of fire is a Three Ratna symbol. And the whole scene is bordered by lotus petals. Now, this is also a moment when Buddha emerged or transformed himself into a pillar of fire. He rarely performed miracles, but this is one of the miracles that is attributed to Buddha. Right? This again is an important kind of a depiction, and this is rather interesting because this depiction becomes very popular from this time onwards and can be seen in almost all renderings in Andhra Pradesh. And this is called the Nallagiri episode, where Mara is kind of a anti-hero force. You know, he is evil. He is known as Mar Papima. He is a cousin of Buddha, and he incites this particular elephant to become mast or a rampaging elephant. And this elephant, as you can see on one side of the depiction, is he has one man in his trunk, the other one is being trampled underfoot, and everybody is running helter and skelter and is being very scared and frightened in this panic. But when Nallagiri approaches the Buddha, he bends down and he is subdued, right? And here you can see the disciples of Buddha in the background. There is also people who witness this event in the window. Okay, as I have said that there are various times or moments of stylistic evolution at Amaravati. The earlier period has low relief, it's not very high, it's shallow relief, and stylistically also it is nearer Bharut than the later phase of Amaravati. Here you see a depiction probably of enlightenment or the worship of the Bodhi tree, where the empty seat and the footprints of the Buddha represent the Buddha in his iconic form, and there are women as well as male devotees who are crouched around this particular tree. The parasol also depicts the sovereignty of and presence of Buddha. Right? Similarly, there are other phases in the sculptural art of Amaravati where you have episodes from the life of. Okay, these are some of the other architectural pieces. Right. Now we come to the drum slabs. Now, I would like to again at this point just point out that there has been a kind of a misunderstanding about Amaravati. A lot of people call the stones of Amaravati as marble, but these are not marble, these are limestone, whitish green limestone that is easier to carve than marble, and that is why you have such a lot of detail that can be discerned in Amaravati sculptures, and the depth of relief is also only possible because of the softer limestone being used for carving. Now you will see that there is this was carved on both sides and has been and these it represents different times of carving. Okay, all in drum slabs you see that there are chronologically hierarchical evolution of art. The earlier carvings can be dated from approximately the 1st century BC, and they show a group of men worshipping the Buddha who had received or achieved enlightenment. On the other side is an elaborately carved stupa from the 3rd century AD, and the base of the throne are a pair of Buddha padas, and then there is the dharma chakras, there are worshippers, there are kinnaras, there is an empty throne, the footprints, etc. that can be seen on these drum slabs, this one and the ones that I will be showing you later. Sometimes the Buddha is shown as a human figure and sometimes he is not shown as a human figure. In this case, you can see that the Buddha is being shown in his human form. But that is not always the case. Sometimes he is shown through relics or through the empty throne. But here, interestingly, what you see again is the replication of the stupa itself in the art of Amaravati. The stupa as it exists with the 5 ayaka pillars, the railing, the carvings on the drum slab and the garlands on top of the dome, all of these are being depicted and replicated on the stupa itself. So, the stupa becomes an object not only of worship, but an object of ornamentation and meditation. So, by repetition of the same motif, so to speak, around the pradakshina and the drum, you are actually emphasizing on the scenes of the Buddha and the importance of the stupa itself. All right. This can be, the importance of the stupa is seen here in a depiction of the adoration of the stupa. This is something that starts early and from the Bharut period onwards and continues in Sanchi, in Mathura, etc. But here it becomes almost an ornamental symbol itself. This is a relatively earlier depiction where you can see that the Dharma Chakra with the 3 Ratna is on top. There is a line of animals, and then the 3rd register at the bottom shows the stupa parasols, which again symbolize a kind of sovereignty on and the worshippers, both probably human and celestial both are being depicted here. Now, the other important thing is that the stupa is not just the stupa, but it is also a symbol of parinirvana, that is the achievement of nirvana by Buddha. So, a stupa is actually a relic it enshrines the relics of Buddha and all important disciples of Buddha. So, here it is also reflecting that the sovereignty of Buddha per se is being shown through a depiction such as this, all right. Besides that, we have talked about an iconic symbol, such as the Stupa, but there are also limestone panels depicting the Buddha path or the footprints of Buddha, and in the early period of Buddhist sculpture in India, the Buddha was not represented through his human form, he was indicated through symbols such as this, right. On this you will notice that there are auspicious signs such as this chakra and other motifs which could include the swastika, the Srivatsa and other such Mangala signs of auspiciousness, which are also to be seen in Ayakapattas of the Jainas. So, this is something that is common to the cultural matrix of the post-modern period, where Mangala are symbols are shown on various sculptural pieces. All right. Now, we come to the third element of the railing, which are the coping stones. The coping stones, as we saw in the first slide, are the stones that unite the entire railing in one compositional scheme, and here you will see that there are various scenes from the life of Buddha, and here Buddha is shown in his iconic form. The first one is Buddha leaving, all right. The second one is Buddha achieving enlightenment. The third one is the Buddha being threatened by the army of Mara, known as Mar Dharashan, and how Mara on his elephant is entering into the scene. This is again a very important panel, which is known as the Saundarnanda panel. The reason for this is that because it tells the story of Sundari and Nanda, that is also eulogized or immortalized in a long kavya by Ashwaghosh called Saundarnanda. This kavya or Sanskrit poetry was written during the Kushana period, somewhere during the 2nd century CE. But the story that it represents is probably something that was common to both the visual as well as the literary tradition. Here you see the king, who is a Nanda, who is a cousin of Buddha, disporting with his wife Sundari in the palace. As he is, as the story goes, as he is disporting with his wife, a monk, or the Buddha himself first comes and tries for alms, but Nanda is too busy and he does not pay attention to the visit of Buddha. Later, of course, he is persuaded to leave his wife as well as the palace and the world per se and become a monk. One of the persons who does this is a monk from the Buddhist Sangha, who you can see sitting on a stool under the throne. All right. Again, this is kind of a comic strip kind of a narration, but a very important narrative from the life of Buddha. It shows 4 scenes from the birth of Buddha. The first scene on the top right panel depicts this sleeping queen Maya, who dreams of Buddha descending into her womb as a white elephant from the Tushita heaven, and as she's reclining on a couch, and all her attendant ladies of the hero are around her. The next panel on the left of this, you will see that it is the interpretation of the dream by astrologers of the court, especially a sage called Ashita, who you can see here on the bottom, and you can see Queen Maya as well as her husband, the father of Buddha, King Shuddhodhana, on the throne. The interpretation of the dream is that the son soon to be born to Maya is going to be a Mahapurush, and he will leave the palace and the kingdom, but he will gain great fame as well as spiritual merit for his parents. Underneath this, on the bottom right panel, you will see the birth of Buddha in the Lumbini forest. Here you see Queen Maya Devi holding a branch with her hand, and the attendant ladies, in this case it may be her younger sister Prajapati, but Buddha emerges, who you can't see, but the presence of Buddha can be made out by the footsteps on the cloth, emerges like a Mahapurusha from the side, the right side of Maya Devi, and is received by various gods such as Indra, Surya, etc. And as soon as he is born, he walks 7 steps. The 7 steps are marked on the here on the cloth. Okay, and the last, on the bottom right of the panel, you will see that there is the presentation of the Buddha to a yaksha of the tree, or the vriksha yaksha, who is known as Shakya Vardhana, and around the platform are offerings, and the yaksha bows to the baby Buddha in Maya Devi's lap on a cloth, because he is overwhelmed to see the tej, or the force or the spirit which Buddha embodies. Right. This is the great departure, as it here. The empty horse with the parasol represents the Buddha leaving on his horse the Kantaka. But what I would like to point out is that if you can see this gate or the Torana, this is very much like the one that you see at Sanchi. So, the architecture that is being depicted in various monuments such as Amaravati is representation of the actual monuments. Right. This is a Chakravartin with his hands folded in Anjali Mudra. This is a relatively later depiction, but on either side are 2 attendants, 3 women and 1 man, and they are all holding fly whisks or chowries in obeisance. This is to show you stylistic developments, right. This is an unidentified scene, but it shows a woman whose anklets are being removed or put on by a diminutive person, while a man with a horse is seen on her side. Okay. This is to show you how other depictions of yoginis and taras comes up in the early medieval period at Amaravati, as Amaravati remains a great cultural site, all right, for a very, very long period. Here, these are some of the last that I am showing you. Here you can see that she is holding a pash, a bowl in her hand. Again, Here you can see Bodhisattva, another Bodhisattva from the same site, but the style is becoming more like the Gupta Vakataka style, and you can see discern classical and early post-classical phases in Amaravati.